Are you a brand new podcaster, hoping to share what you're passionate about to whoever's willing to listen, but you aren't sure where to start? Navigating the logistics of your podcast can be confusing, from tracking growth to getting your podcast on the biggest platforms like Apple and Spotify. That's why I use Captivate. Captivate is a podcast publishing site that's user-friendly and offers everything you need to fulfill your podcast's full potential. They'll help you publish your podcast to all of the most popular platforms, as well as help you track your growth through daily, weekly, 28, and 90-day download numbers, as well as the averages, so you can see where your podcast might be flourishing or floundering. What's more, they'll help you with promotion and advertising. They offer free courses on how to start and run the perfect podcast, and they even throw in a free website with your subscription, completely customizable to fit your podcast's personality. You can sign up now starting at $19 a month, and you'll even get a free 7-day trial so you can decide whether or not it's right for you. Sign up today at thezoologist.net/captivate, and what's more, you'll be supporting my show. Captivate truly is a podcaster's best friend. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Zoologist Podcast. I'm your host, Jake, and today we'll be learning more facts and hearing more stories about some of the amazing animals that inhabit our planet today. As always, let's get ready to get wild. Today's episode is one I've been planning for a while, and one that I'm super excited about. We'll be reviewing, or I guess you could say scrutinizing, the movie Jaws, a film that was wildly popular when it was released back in 1975, and that has since become a cultural icon. Specifically, the movie is famous for its portrayal of the great white shark, depicting the mighty predator as a man-eating menace. The movie has terrified and thrilled audiences for almost half a century, but how accurate is this representation of the great white? And do sharks in general deserve the reputation they gained from the blockbuster film? Today we're on a quest to answer the question, just how realistic is Jaws? Grab your popcorn, settle into your seat, and let's dive in. Hello everyone, hope you're having a wonderful day. Thank you so much for hopping on to today's episode of The Zoologist. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, welcome. We teach and learn something new about the animal kingdom each week, so if that sounds like your cup of tea, sit back and enjoy, and be sure to catch one of our earlier episodes as well. We've already discussed everything from emus to elephants on this podcast, so if you're interested, go ahead and listen to those whenever you get the chance. For those of you who have listened to The Zoologist before, welcome back. Thank you so much for hopping on again, and if you've really liked what you've heard, be sure to share us on social media or with your friends and family. Make sure to let them know what we're all about. Now, I hope you're all prepared because we've got an exciting episode on tap for today. I'm going to assume that most of you listening have seen the movie Jaws at some point during your life. If you've never seen Jaws before, no worries. I actually hadn't seen it myself until about a week ago. I figured if I was going to do an episode about Jaws, I needed to actually watch the movie itself. And I'm really glad I did, by the way. It's an excellent movie. If you don't know the plot, in a nutshell, it's about a small town in New England where a great white shark is going around eating and attacking the residents. And that's it. I wish I could say there was more to it, but that pretty much sums it up. Very straightforward, but it's very well put together. It holds up very well, even almost 50 years later. There's also a Jaws novel, which the movie is based off of. It was a bestseller when it was published back in 1974. But as for the movie, as enjoyable as it may be, I think it's fair to wonder just how realistic is it? It certainly presents itself like it's grounded in reality and scientific fact. For example, one of the main characters is a marine biologist who studies sharks for a living. And at one point you see another one of the main characters, the police chief. You see him reading up on sharks and sharing some of the things that he's learning about them. Despite this, however, there is unsurprisingly a lot, and I do mean a lot, of stuff that Jaws got wrong about great white sharks, and it's really reflected poorly upon sharks in general. This has ended up being a big deal because, for better or worse, Jaws had a huge cultural impact, and it's really shaped the way that most people, really our society, views sharks. That's why I think it's important to set the record straight in some places to help give people a more accurate view and more accurate information about these animals, more accurate information about their behavior, and hopefully help them gain more respect for these incredible creatures. That's why in this episode we will be discussing just how realistic Jaws is, what it got right and what it got wrong about sharks and the great white shark specifically. Now, I do realize that the question, how realistic is Jaws, is a pretty broad one. So to clarify, basically what we'll be doing is exploring how likely the movie's plot would be to happen in real life. What are the odds that a great white shark would attack and eat several people along the shores of a New England town? If it wouldn't be a great white shark, is there another shark species that would behave that way? And if it wouldn't happen in New England, is there another place that it could happen? I'll also be addressing some of the shark facts that the movie presents, and I'll try to summarize what would be a more accurate view of sharks at the end of this episode. First things first, though, let's talk about the location. Can great white sharks really be found off the coast of New England? And the answer to that question is a resounding yes, they can. They're actually one of over 50 shark species that can be found swimming in those waters. In fact, some of those species include tiger sharks, mako sharks, and thresher sharks, all of which are mentioned in the film, so that's a win for Jaws. Great white sharks specifically have a massive range that covers coastal waters all the way from Australia to South Africa to Florida, as well as everywhere in between. Great white sharks usually split their time between waters closer to shore and open ocean habitats, and they've been tracked migrating over hundreds and thousands of miles of open sea. In North America, specifically along the Atlantic coast, they've been sighted from Newfoundland up in Canada all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, and they've been seen along the Pacific coast from the Aleutian Islands up in Alaska all the way down to California. So yes, great whites can indeed be found off the New England coast, and they can be found in areas where they can potentially come into contact with people as well. Adult sharks, for example, often spend time hunting near seal and sea lion rookeries, and when they do this, it sometimes puts them in a position where they can come into contact with human beings. So the location is realistic, the setup is realistic, but what about the shark's behavior itself? Well, it is true that great white sharks can and do attack and occasionally eat people. In fact, there are more reported attacks by great whites than there are any other shark species. And what's more, back in 1916, there was an incident where 5 documented shark attacks occurred off the coast of New Jersey. All of these happened in the span of about 2 weeks, and it led to the deaths of about 4 people. The exact culprit is still hotly debated, but a juvenile great white, about 8 feet long, was pulled from the ocean at the time and was found with human remains in its stomach, so it's generally believed that this is the shark that did it. If that sounds eerily similar to the plot of Jaws, that's because it is. And it seems like hard evidence of Jaws' authenticity. But let's back up for a second. Let's take a look at the statistics, because they paint a very different picture when it comes to shark behavior. The International Shark Attack File, which is a real thing and which I highly recommend looking into, they have statistics on shark attacks going all the way back to 1580. I don't know how that's a thing. I don't know where you get the numbers for that kind of thing. But in any case, according to these statistics, since then there have been 351 reported unprovoked attacks by a great white shark on a human being. And of those, only 59 were fatal. We're talking about statistics going back hundreds and hundreds of years. 59 fatalities during that time. If you want to look at the recent numbers, in the year 2022, among all shark species, not just great whites, there were 57 reported unprovoked attacks, and only 5 of those were fatal. In New England, shark attacks are even more rare. Since 1837, in Maine, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island combined, there have been a grand total of 11 reported unprovoked shark attacks. Now, there are a couple things to keep in mind with these numbers. There are likely many shark attacks that go unreported, and species can be misidentified. So they're not 100% accurate, especially when you consider that these are statistics going back hundreds and hundreds of years. But considering how great whites are often found in areas close to human activity, and considering the millions of people that go swimming in the ocean every year, if these sharks really were bloodthirsty man-eaters, the numbers would be noticeably higher, especially in the past decade or so when humanity has become significantly better connected. And the thing is that a predator the size of a great white shark, it requires a lot of fuel to keep it going. And humans are just too small to be a sustainable food source. If they did regularly attack and eat human beings, they would have to eat a lot of us for it to make a difference. And we know for a fact that they don't do this because these attacks are just too rare. There's a reason these sharks mainly prey on seals and sea lions. These animals are high in fat reserves, and fat is very high in calories. In comparison, eating a human is just not going to get the shark very far. For this reason, it's likely that great whites really only eat humans when they're desperate for food, when they're starving to death, or when they mistake us for their normal prey. And we'll talk more about that theory later. With that in mind, it's probably safe to say that the depiction of the great white in Jaws is highly exaggerated. For the most part, they aren't actively hunting us down, and they definitely don't hold a grudge like the shark in Jaws does. Just to drive this point home, if you get on the internet right now, you can find videos of marine biologists and scientists free swimming with great white sharks without being attacked or bitten. I'm not trying to say these animals are harmless, and I'm not saying that you should hop in a boat and start splashing with the first great white you come across, but I am saying that the way these animals are presented in Jaws is simply not accurate. And speaking of exaggerations, there's a few more things that Jaws got wrong about great whites that I think are worth mentioning. The shark in the movie is 25 feet long, which is ridiculous. That is well beyond even the biggest of great white sharks. I will give them a small pass on this because they do kind of mention that it's a bigger shark than usual. But even then, I mean, generally these sharks are somewhere around 15 to 18 feet long. So definitely nothing to sneeze at, but not the enormous monster that's presented in the film. At one point, one of the characters mentions that these sharks live to be thousands of years old, which is categorically false. That is not true at all. Although, as a bonus fact, there is a species of shark, the Greenland shark, that can live to be over 500 years old. Great whites themselves, they only live to be, I think, 70 years old at the most. One more thing I want to bring up that I noticed. In the movie, when the shark is hunting, the people that they're attacking are just kind of dragged around or they're pulled under the water. That doesn't happen with great whites. That's not how they hunt their prey. The way that great whites hunt their prey is much more terrifying than that. What they do is they barrel full speed into their prey from below. They might bite off a chunk, and then they'll swim away, and then they come back later when the animal has died from blood loss or shock. It's a lot scarier. Probably would have been difficult to pull off in the film, especially at that time, but man, that would have made Jaws probably a million times scarier. So now we know great whites aren't typically man-eaters, but what about other shark species? Is there another shark that hunts down and eats human beings? Well, of the over 300 species of shark in the world, there are only about a dozen that are considered to be dangerous to human beings. Of these, there are 3 shark species that are responsible for the majority of documented attacks on people. We've already talked about the great white, how the great white has the most, and great whites are followed by tiger sharks and bull sharks in those statistics. Tiger sharks do have a reputation for being man-eaters. In fact, tiger sharks have a reputation for eating everything. These sharks have been found with license plates and old tires in their stomach. Bull sharks, meanwhile, are considered by many experts to be probably the most dangerous of all shark species. They're particularly aggressive, and they're often found in high population areas. In fact, because they can survive in freshwater and brackish water, which is just a mix of freshwater and ocean water, they can be found inland in places that other sharks can't access. For example, bull sharks have been found up the Mississippi River all the way up to St. Louis, which is a terrifying thought. And then there's, just to kind of add to all this, there's the story of the USS Indianapolis. This is something that the movie brought up that was actually accurate. At one point, one of the characters in the movie, Quint, he's telling a story about sharks attacking shipwreck survivors from a World War II cruiser. And as it turns out, the story is completely true. This incident did actually happen. It was 1945. This ship was on its way to the Philippines to prepare for a potential invasion of Japan, and the ship was struck and sunk by a Japanese torpedo in the South Pacific. There were over 1,100 men on board. About 900 of the crew members survived the attack and the sinking itself and were able to make it into the water. And while they were floating there, many of those that survived were reportedly attacked and eaten by sharks. The remaining survivors were rescued about 4 days later. It's estimated that during that time, anywhere from a few dozen to 150 men were killed by these sharks, although it's possible that there were many, many more than that were killed. The culprit in this case is believed to have been mostly oceanic whitetips. Oceanic whitetips are a species of open ocean shark. They're known to be aggressive towards humans, and these sharks are actually infamous for attacking survivors of shipwrecks and plane crashes out in the open ocean. So with all that in mind, could one of these sharks be responsible for terrorizing a coastal town? Well, again, the statistics are underwhelming. Keep in mind that these sharks have even less documented attacks on their record than great whites. The odds that you'll ever be killed by a shark, any shark, during your lifetime is 1 in 4.3 million. So it's unlikely that you're going to be eaten by any of these species, and even more unlikely that one of them is going to be going around terrorizing the beaches of a single resort town. Oceanic whitetips are probably the only species that I would be especially concerned about. I want to talk about oceanic whitetips for a minute because they're very opportunistic hunters. Like tiger sharks, it seems like they have earned themselves a reputation for being man-eaters. The statistics on how many people have been killed by oceanic whitetips is low, but it's likely that they're actually much, much higher than we know because many of their attacks probably go unreported since they're farther out in the ocean than other shark attacks. So it's been proposed that these sharks likely have more fatal attacks to their name than any other shark species on Earth. So pretty scary, but it's also important to keep in mind that these sharks usually live farther out in the ocean where the water is deeper. They're not usually found in close proximity to human beings, so they don't really run into people very often. Most of the people that get attacked, like I said, are shipwreck survivors or people who survive plane crashes or divers. They don't run into people very often. They're certainly not going to be responsible for a string of attacks next to a populous shoreline. The thing is, the whole concept of Jaws is very similar to a theory that originated in the early to mid-20th century. It's called rogue shark theory. In fact, the premise of this theory is a huge part of the movie's plot. And it basically states that once a shark has gained a taste for blood, it'll go on a killing spree. It becomes a man-eater. And it will stay within a certain geographic area, and it'll hunt down human beings until it's stopped. This is a theory that originated with actually the shark attacks along the Jersey Shore that we've already talked about. But the thing is that this theory has been completely debunked. A single shark is rarely responsible for multiple attacks on human beings. According to one expert from the International Shark Attack File, there have only been 2 or 3 times total in the past 3 centuries when a single shark is thought to have been responsible for multiple attacks. And only one of those is backed up with reasonable proof. And in that case, all of the attacks occurred within minutes of one another. Because these situations are so rare, it's reasonable to assume that there are other factors at work. It might be food deprivation, it might be misidentification of prey, but just the rogue shark theory is completely bogus. It's just not a thing. Alrighty, I think that's a good place to take a break. I'm going to step aside for a minute, and we'll be back right after this. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back as we continue our discussion about sharks and why they attack. Before the break, I was talking a little bit about the rogue shark theory. I forgot to mention, as for the 1916 attacks, just to give you more context for these attacks, there are some experts who believe a bull shark was actually responsible for them because some of these attacks occurred in a freshwater creek. And in all honesty, it might have been both a bull shark and a juvenile great white. In any case, we don't know what other factors may have been involved, even if we assume all the attacks were done by the same shark. And so this incident that kind of sparked this theory, it's not as cut and dry as it might seem. Despite how rare shark attacks are, though, the fact is they do happen. And it does beg the question, if sharks aren't bloodthirsty man-eaters, then why are they attacking people at all? Well, we don't know for sure. There's probably several reasons for why sharks attack. I've already mentioned a few of them. I've mentioned how sharks might be desperate, they might be starving. I've talked about misidentification of prey. There have been several theories put forward to try and explain why these events happen. And there are a few theories that I want to dive into in particular because they seem pretty popular and they're the ones that seem the most plausible to me. The first of the three I mentioned a lot. It's mistaken identity. This is a theory that applies to great white sharks specifically. And the idea is that great white sharks, looking up from below, will mistake swimmers or surfers for seals, their favorite prey. And there is evidence that supports this theory. In 2021, there was a group of researchers that performed an experiment where they compared video footage of a seal, a human swimmer, and a surfer from a shark's point of view. And then they processed it in a way that mimicked a shark's vision. And what they found is that from a shark's perspective, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to tell a swimmer, a seal, and a surfer apart. There are scientists that reject this theory just because sharks have an incredible array of very finely tuned senses. They're extremely efficient hunters. For example, they have an excellent sense of smell. They can detect pressure changes in the water. They even have electroreceptors that allow them to sense the electric field around other organisms. Because of this, some scientists think that the idea that a shark could mistake a human for a seal is silly. Instead, they theorize that these sharks are acting defensively. They're trying to get people to leave the area. Some sharks have been observed making defensive postures before an attack, which possibly signals that these sharks are just trying to warn people to get away. This would make sense because it explains why shark attacks, even when they do happen, they're rarely fatal. Another theory that's been proposed is that the sharks are just curious. Great whites, in particular, they have very sensitive teeth, and it's possible that when they bite, they're simply investigating something that's new to them in their environment. And again, this is another theory that would explain why shark attacks are rarely fatal. Honestly, the way that great whites hunt and the way that sharks hunt, if a shark wants to kill a human being, it absolutely can. The idea that most of these attacks or all of these attacks are sharks hunting a human being and trying to eat it is just not likely. Anyway, when you look at all the evidence, the fact is that the way sharks, and specifically great whites, are portrayed in Jaws is highly exaggerated. Yes, these animals are dangerous. Yes, they will attack and sometimes eat human beings, but these shark attacks are so rare that I think it's fair to say that for the most part, they're outliers. They're not patterns. If you're really concerned about shark attacks, just be sure to take precautions. Do your research so you know what to do if a shark does get aggressive. At the end of the day, though, for everything that Jaws got wrong, like I said, for better or worse, it had an enormous cultural impact. It is important to note that back when the book was written and when the movie was released, very, very little was known about the great white shark. We still know relatively little today, but what was known about those sharks back then was almost nothing, from what I understand, which should explain how they got so much wrong about these sharks. I think a good question to ask is, what was the aftermath of all this terrible science? Like, what happened to the sharks? Well, beyond continuing to tarnish the shark's reputation, after the release of Jaws, there was a rise in sport fishing. There's a lot of people that headed out on their boats hoping to net themselves a great white, and they didn't have any remorse about it because great whites were merciless killers. They were out to get us. Because of the sport fishing, there was a decline in the population numbers of great white sharks after the film, although commercial fishing was and still is a far bigger threat to the future of the species. On the other hand, it also created a bigger push for more scientific research to be done on the animal. So there's a chance we wouldn't know what we now know about these toothy fish if the book hadn't been written and the movie hadn't come out. For what it's worth, the author of Jaws, a man by the name of Peter Benchley, he later regretted his portrayal of the animal, and he became a conservationist later in his life, trying to save sharks. Steven Spielberg, who directed the movie, he also has stated that he regrets how the shark's portrayal led to its population decline. So overall, it definitely had a lot of negative effects long term, but it seems like there was some good that came out of it as well. And the good news is that the great whites population numbers do seem to be rising. And for those of you who are worried about going for a swim on the 4th of July or wondering whether or not you'll need a bigger boat, just know that you're probably going to be okay. Thank you so much for hopping on and listening to today's episode of the Zoologist Podcast. This is an episode I've been looking forward to for a long, long time, so I hope you enjoyed it. There's a lot more to this topic that I couldn't get to today, so I'll be leaving the research links I used for today's episode in the show notes. Go ahead and look through those if you get a chance. If you're enjoying the podcast overall, or even if you're not, be sure to leave us a review. You can review us on iTunes, Spotify, Podchaser works as well. These reviews, they mean a lot to me. I'm always looking for feedback on the show, so go ahead and leave one if you get a chance. I hope you all have a great week, and as always, have a wild day.